So, the Battle of Sinop, 30th of November, 1853. Now, 170 years ago today, and I have a feeling this will be today. I have a feeling I will have had to rearrange the live, because I'm recording this on the 30th, and the live is supposed to be on the 30th, but we've been having snow and high winds, and every time the snow builds up to a certain level on the Starlink, it makes it go very fuzzy in terms of the data quality, and it goes down for quite a while below the level at which, whilst it's still fine for internet and access and still great for that, in terms of uploading a live and doing my end of a live stream rather than the downloading of the live stream, it's not that good. In fact, it doesn't really work. So I have a feeling this will be going up instead. Probably slightly later than live was originally planned for, but it will be going up. Why do you think we're suddenly going up slightly later than live was originally planned for? Because this is my practice before the live. And so this is me practicing, and it's the one I'm going to have recorded most recently and most fully. So, the Battle of Sinop. The death of the wooden wall, or just another Ottoman-Russian tangle? Now, why do I have that there? Why do I have the death of the wooden wall? Because the amount of people who turn around and go, well, the explosive shells at this point meant that the moment they were used in this battle, it was going to be ironclad warships sooner or later. Yeah. But saying that, there were also quite a lot of people who took from this the evidence that if you're going to build a fleet, don't entrust and going to go to the trouble of getting in technical and capable experts to build a modern fleet, do not then entrust it to someone who's going to position it between your own forts and the enemy. Let alone, and here is the real problem, don't cheap out building frigates, large frigates, when what you need to do is have ships of the line, because that's who you're going to go fight. There were quite a few people who went, this was not the end of the wooden wall, because, let's be honest, the wooden wall that there was getting blown up at Sinop was not the wooden wall of even 1805 fame, let alone the wooden wall that could be built in this period. Just a small problem there. It's the same case of quite a lot of people took the lesson from the War of 1812 that the American super frigates were a really good idea, a really cost-effective way of getting a very capable ship, and they are. But they forgot the lesson of 1812 was those frigates can absolutely rule the day fighting other frigates. The moment they find themselves against a ship of the line, they're kind of in trouble. Even a Razade ship of the line is going to cause them a lot of trouble, because a Razade will be built with, will of course be a cut down ship of the line that's been Razade into a frigate, and that's going to be built with heavy timbers that would have been used for a ship of the line, and it's going to be built with the, with the cannon capacity for larger cannon. All these things make it a very bad decision to take a frigate against a ship of the line in a fight. Doesn't matter how many guns that frigate has. It's not sensible. There's also other factors which are affecting sort of the armour and the development of things. There's the engine's development. There's all sorts of different things taking place. And honestly, this battle is not good for showing off the engine capabilities, other than the fact that the ship gets away. All in all, though, it's an interesting battle, and it's an interesting timeline point to focus on. Because it is at that turning point. It is a few years before everything comes together in Gloire and then Warrior. It does have all those major actors involved. Napoleon III, who's, well, being his usual pompous self and trying to expand into various parts of the Ottoman Empire. Same with Russia. Same with Britain. Honestly, the fact is, it's a really interesting war, the Crimean War, in terms of starters. And it's what's most interesting is that quite a lot of the people, the advice being sought by the various political and leaders of nations, is from historians. And historians can really give you whatever advice you want. Again, I'm going to apologize for this behind me. I was trying to avoid just mentioning it all, but again, the normal thing has happened in that I'm here, and so is my sleeping fluffy research assistant. So yeah, make sure I'm talking away to you. But yeah, he's it was neat. It was neat. I do make my bed, and it is neat normally. And then someone decides it's his daybed. Anyway, without much further ado, shameless book plug. Second edition is out. Thank you again to everyone's support of the channel. It's quite interesting recently because, as many of you who follow the channel know, I am publishing rather more than I normally do. This is A, because I normally do more at Christmas, and B, because I have more free time at the moment because of the mercurial nature of university employment. And leaving that to one side, it's been really kind of interesting how recently the viewership has jumped. I've had almost 50% more views than I normally do in a 28-day period, which is lovely. It's really nice to know I'm reaching that many people with my naval history. And in terms of audience, it's doing pretty well as well. But yeah, I will say this. I have a lot of viewers now who are unsubscribed viewers. Almost 50% of my channel's viewership, people who view my videos, have not subscribed. I'd love to change that because if many of you don't know, and probably the unsubscribed ones do not know, there's currently a competition going on between my aunt and my mum, which went on for a few years as a sort of family-friendly bet. They are non-identical twins. And the target was 10,000. Came within a smidgen last Christmas. Didn't get there. So my aunt won again. And she's now made it 15,000. So, I'm not going to say anything, but there are enough of you that I think if you all subscribed, then the bet would finally be over. And my mum has promised that if she wins, the bet is over. But that it's a running bet of baking a cake for each other, whether or not I've got so many subscribers. It's not a monetary or anything like that. It's family bragging rights bet. Okay. Every year, why do they set it and do it for Christmas? Why? I know we do have Christmas bets, but why that one? Anyway. So the Crimean War. The Crimean War is not really a separate war. It really isn't. There have been so many wars taking place between Russia and the Ottoman Empire. At this point, it's just an ongoing battle. It's an ongoing struggle. Think Japan, China in the 1900s. It's non-stop. There's always something flaring up. Even when there's not something flaring up, the two sides are engaged in a struggle whether one side wishes to be or not. And you have this really excellent quote, which is sent, well, it's in a memorandum, a briefing document prepared by a historian, for Nicholas I, the Tsar. And it says this: France takes Algeria from Turkey. And no, they called the Ottoman Empire Turkey. Almost every year, England annexes another Indian principality. To be fair, Britain have been there for a while. None of this disturbs the balance of power. Not really, because Britain, whether they had formal control or didn't have formal control of India, was pretty much de facto in control of India by this point, because that was how it had turned out by about 1853. With France taking Algeria from Turkey, that was annoying. But honestly, that was more a deal with the potential piracy issue and stop the Turks having such large navy to go and keep beating up the Greeks, because we'd like the Greco-Turkish wars to be over. Or rather, the Greco-Ottoman wars to be over. But yes, he is right. But when Russia occupies Moldavia and Wallachia, albeit only temporarily, that disturbs the balance of power. True. Because what at this point has decided it's a two-way power split between France and Britain. So anyone else rising up disturbs the balance of power. Once you get to the top, people often automatically turn around and start pulling the ladder up behind me. Ladder up behind them that they can use to get to the top. It's the same with nation states. France occupies Rome and stays there several years during peacetime. That is nothing. But Russia only thinks of occupying Constantinople, and the peace of Europe is threatened. The English declare war on the Chinese, who have, it seems, offended them. I think that's probably... I'm trying to remember which of the... which of the Opium Wars that was, but... yeah... It's always great to tell people that the first major drug wars were fought to supply drugs. At the point of a cannon. But Russia is obliged to ask Europe for permission if it quarrels with its neighbours. That's because when England quarrels with its neighbours with France, and then everyone's getting involved, whether they like it or not. That's the entire Napoleonic Wars. Britain quarrelling with France. Let's be honest. If Britain's not part of the alliance against France, it ain't happening because it ain't going to be funded. And if France isn't part of the alliance against Britain, it's got no chance because they're the only ones who come close in this period. And when I say close, I mean in terms of being able to coordinate their infrastructure to generate sufficient naval force. The others just can't. And the trouble is, coordination of French naval infrastructure after this period starts to decline rapidly as each of the yards develop their own personality and view of what actually represents a good ship to build. It's great when you're trying to build a class. England threatens Greece to support the false claims of a miserable Jew and burns its fleet. I think that was because the Greeks owed some money to someone. This is a lawful action. Yeah. You pay up. If you owe money to the British, you will pay. These days we don't tend to send a fleet in. We send a fleet of lawyers instead. One was over far too quickly and far too kind. And that is deemed to strengthen its, that is a lawful action. But Russia demands a treaty to protect millions of Christians, and as it is deemed to strengthen its position in the East at the expense of the balance of power. We can expect nothing from the West but blind hatred and malice. Okay, that particular treaty that they were demanding was actually a treaty which they had, where they were responsible for all the Christian sites within the Ottoman Empire. And Napoleon III wants that, because Napoleon III wants control of those Christian sites within the Ottoman Empire, i.e. Jerusalem, for the Catholic Church, because that will strengthen his position at home domestically. It's the same with the Tsar wanting it for the Orthodox Church, because it strengthens his position at home domestically. In reality, this is all fighting over internal politics between France and Russia, and the Ottoman Empire, which is pretty much collapsing at this point, is stuck in the middle. But Nicholas the First comments in this is the whole point. Well, yeah, but it's also rather stating the obvious. I.e., Russia seems to be surprised when other people are acting in their own interests. They don't care what's fair. Fair is for the playground. Fair is for Christmas and birthday parties when cutting up the cake. Fair is for those sorts of nice things. Relations between states are not fair. They're not necessarily the weak, the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must. That's not necessarily the case. There is very many cases where you can offset that one. But the reality, expecting them to be fair, expecting there to be one rule for everyone, not one rule for one power and one rule for another, is a completely different matter, because what's going to matter is how it's presented. And the trouble is for Russia, is how they present things. Russia often, in its history, tries so many loopholes, tries so many things that they actually end up embarrassing themselves. Even if we consider, and I don't want to get involved in the politics of it, I'm not going to, but to this, the fact that I still see reports coming out from Russia which called the operation in Ukraine a special military operation. No, it's a war. Just be honest. It's a war. I don't care what you could argue. What it started out as was that, but that was another phrase for invasion. But yeah, you can argue that. But by this point, I'm thinking, if there's anyone who still believes it's not a war, no. And that's just, this is the reality. You have to be careful in how you present things. How does Britain present the Opium Wars? They are presenting it against China because they're opening up for trade. They are opening up for trade. They are, and yeah, that is unupsetting to the rest of the world, because by this point, everyone else in the world is getting upset with China. Because Britain's saying, we have to have something we can trade with you other than silver and gold. Because there isn't enough silver and gold in the world to satisfy your demands for it, for the goods we need out of you. Those are goods our population and merchants want. It's good for our economies to be selling those goods around. But we have to be able to sell something to you. And the trouble is, for China, etc., they wanted to sell the stuff because they wanted the money to come in. But they didn't want to they didn't want to buy any goods or take anything from it in return, because they didn't want the money to go out. And then an illegal trade turns up very quickly, which is of course opium. And so the Opium Wars are, well, this is something they already want, so we're just fighting for the right to sell you what you already want. And trouble is, they can't resist that. They can't resist that because there's no one who would support them in that argument, because everyone is upset, is annoyed with them over that and their decisions. And no one wants to fight Britain. Whereas for Russia, the trouble is with them is they might put in treaties, and they do. They have all sorts of treaties they propose, and including dividing up the Ottoman Empire between Britain and Russia, where they hand over Egypt and various territories. Egypt and Cyprus get handed over to Britain, and they take everything else. Now, considering Russia keeps making moves in the direction of India as well, can you see why Britain might not think that's a good deal? So, Russia gets the Middle East. Yeah, and they can then mass troops and go down on the Suez Canal. They can attack India. That's not something Britain's going to agree to. It fits in your worldview, Russia, because you get what you want. And you think you're giving Britain enough to justify for Britain to... But Britain's looking this long term going, that's not going to make you happy, and you're going to come for us. And the problem for Russia is that unlike Britain, they aren't able to stop everyone else getting involved. No one else, whereas with China, no one's prepared to go in and back up China against Britain in the Opium Wars. There are lots of people prepared to keep the Ottomans going for the sake of stopping Russia getting to those territories. Because, again, and let's put it this way, if you're signing offering a treaty where you're planning to divide up someone else's territory, how long will the British will think, well, how long until you offer that to someone else to divide up our territory? And Britain prefers not to have a massive army. And then we've got France involved in this mixture. Well, France is another one that's traditionally a Russian ally. But they're a Russian ally when Russia is in the right place for France. Which means they can't be able to threaten France. Beyond that, there's also the facts and a very old saying. If you owe the bank £100,000, the bank owns you. Owe the bank £100 million, you own the bank. The Ottoman Empire had, throughout the 1850s, become more and more in debt to Britain and France. And even in the 1840s, it had been the case. But by 1853, it's bad. And this is something the Tsar forgets completely. He, when he's offering treaties which would divide up the Ottoman Empire between Britain and Russia, well, there's two problems with that. I possibly have already mentioned the fact of, well, Britain's not too keen on just having control of Egypt and Cyprus, and then the Russians having control of the rest of the Middle East because of India. Well, there's also the fact that if they do that, who's going to pay back the debt that Britain will be owed from the Ottomans? That's a lot of money. Now, this can be seen in other issues. This can be seen in other issues, though, as one of the reasons why the Tsar thinks the Ottoman Empire is ripe for conquest is the cuts that they've made to try and repay in their armed forces, to try and repay the debts they owe, to try and repay what they need to. Not necessarily a good idea. It certainly wasn't a good idea in terms of long-term security. Now, to an extent, the Ottomans can afford to do that because they know the French and the British have to support them to protect them and protect their own investments. But there are still some interesting things. If you consider the war at sea, well, there isn't really much of a war at sea before Sinop. And the reason is because mostly the Ottomans are moving convoys backwards and forwards. They are moving supplies to where they are fighting. Because they're doing quite well. This is one of the things. The Russians managed to siege much of Moldavia and Wallachia. The Ottoman Danube area. But the Ottomans start to do quite well in the Caucasus. And in fact, you could argue that they are actually doing far better than the Russians were prepared for. The Russian Caucasus Corps is, at one point in danger of being surrounded. The Ottoman troops might not have been well paid for, but they are certainly well led and well motivated. And this brings us back to the supplies, because the supply convoys going backwards and forwards is what they're moving the ships across. And basically, they do this a few convoys like this, and then the convoy ends up having to winter in Sinop. Now, the Ottomans had wanted actually to send some ships of the line to Sinop. They had wanted to. Often, and that's one of the things that they claim, and that's mentioned in the Thin Red Line Eyewitness of the History of the Crimean War, and certainly lots of people try and claim it's the British who stop it. But there are other accounts, which is probably less famous, which basically suggest that the British tell them not to send them because the British know in what state the Russian ships of the line currently are. There is a reason the Ottomans what state the Ottoman ships line currently are, because they know the Ottomans have been absolutely bending over backwards to get their frigates going, and even their large frigates going and keep them moving. Their actual ships that align, those cuts have done even more damage to their stores and supplies. Those vessels are not ready. Those vessels are not ready. Their crews are not ready. They're not in a condition. So it's kind of useful for the Ottomans. And please note, before anyone, because sometimes when I say these things, people like to put comments under the video going, "Oh, this is you being..." How do I put this? Because they're very careful not to use the racist word. I have to notice that one somewhere. But, you know, British first and all those sort of things. I'm not. In the nicest way, the amount of times the Royal Navy's been caught napping in its history because of a lack of investment in maintenance of ships. If you want to look at something, it's called this raid on the Medway by the Dutch. That's a good example of what happens if you're not funding your fleet properly. If there's any disruptions in funding. Well, yeah. The Ottomans have been suffering major disruptions in funding. So their ships aren't ready. They might want to deploy them. They might ask to deploy them. But the reality is, they're not ready. And the British know this probably better than most. They have a reason they know this better than most. A very big reason they know it better than most. But before we get into that reason, let's consider the Russian commanders. So, you have in charge Admiral Pavel Stefanovich Nakhimov. This one. He's an interesting character. He dies heroically in the defense of Sevastopol. He wins a victory. And he is, how do I put this? Successful and well known enough that the communists, rather than wiping him from history, use him. They do whole movies about him. Although the first version of the movie made about him had too much dancing and not enough serious history in it. The Communist Party did like their serious history. Honestly, myself, having read about Nakhimov as much as I have done, I think he'd have enjoyed the dancing. But that's just my view. He is an experienced naval officer. A very experienced naval officer. He had fought... Well, he'd served since 1818. But he's fought in the Greek War of Independence. He'd been at the Battle of Navarino. He fought in the Russo-Turkish War of 1828-29, and of course, he's in the Crimean War. He entered the Naval Academy for Nobility in 1817, and he'd made his first sea voyage in the same year aboard the Phoenix, going to the shores of Sweden and Denmark. He's promoted to an NCO at that point, and then, in February 1818, he's passed his examinations and becomes a midshipman, and is assigned to the second fleet crew of the Flozetsky Ekipaz. Flotsky Ekipaz. I think, but it's the ZH sound, and I am terrible at the ZH sound in Russian. Of the Russian Navy's Baltic Fleet. He spends, in fact, quite a large part of his career assigned to the Baltic Fleet. And it's only later on that he is sent on a round-the-globe expedition, and then eventually manages to get to other parts of the world in order to grow his career. Now, in contrast, his second-in-command... Well, he's quite an interesting one to try and track down. In fact, I would say this. Now, he, of course, didn't die in the defense of Sevastopol. So he doesn't get the movie. And he is not treated as well by the communist historians. But he is a good and reliable officer. He is another experienced naval officer. And again, it's worthwhile looking him up. But what's the more important thing of his addition to this battle? What does he do at Sinop? Well, he's the second in command. He is the person who holds the line behind Nakhimov. He is the person who provides him the support, brings the squadron out to relieve him, to support him in the battle that takes place, and pretty much spends his entire time organizing his fleet for him. They are a very good pair in that Nakhimov can trust Novolisky to get on with the administration, to get on with the organization, to build the fleet and put it together so that he can then use it. They work well together. They're a partnership which has to be respected in some regards. That's an important attribute, especially when we consider a later Russian expedition. The story of the 2nd and 3rd Pacific Squadrons and leading up to the Battle of Tsushima, where frankly it all pretty much fell on Rozelensky, and whilst there were others out there, they didn't really rise to the occasion. It's one of those things. Now, here is where we get into some interesting things, because one of these guys is not there at the battle. He is not anywhere near the battle, but I'm including him. Why? Well, let's first consider the admiral who is there. Patrona Osman Pasha. This has been pictured in a hospital in 1854 in Russia. Patrona was sort of the equivalent of vice admiral at the time, but they would later get rid of that rank by the time he returned after being a prisoner. So, you know, he's a fairly experienced officer again. He's trying his best. If he'd had ships of the line, he might have stood a chance of what he was doing, but I used the phrase earlier of anchoring himself between the guns of the forts and the guns of the enemy ships. But another phrase that can be used is under the guns of the forts, to have them protect him. And that could well have been the case, but the trouble is, where he was and where those forts were didn't really help him. Now, why did the British know all about the Ottoman fleet and what its qualities are going on? Well, Mushava Pasha, Mosvir Pasha, Adolphus Slade, a captain in the Royal Navy as of 1849, served in the Ottoman Navy as the inspector of the Navy, basically in charge of rebuilding the Ottoman Navy from 1849 to 1866. He returns to the Royal Navy, receives a KCB in 1858, and while he's out there, and then becomes an admiral in the rear admiral in the Royal Navy in 1866. He's been a full admiral pretty much, as he's been treated in the Ottoman fleet for all those years, but Royal Navy, he's a rear admiral. Don't worry, he then goes into rear admiral, retired, and then vice admiral, retired. He doesn't serve that long in the Royal Navy. But he's been sent out there to rebuild the Ottoman fleet and to get it working again. He's the one in charge of assigning ships and trying to mobilize them on the budget he's got. And he does a very good job. He does a very good job. Now, at this point, why are the Ottomans hiring in from outside? Well, there's two reasons. One, they have a problem. With the loss of some of their supporting states, they've lost a large pool of their experienced personnel who they were usually called upon as part of their forces to provide the senior officers and administrators who had run the empire. Secondly, their other big problem is that a lot of the people they do have might not necessarily be as good at the job as they used to be. in that a lot of them are stuck into a very particular way of doing things, and as such are unable to evolve to the new systems. Along with reforming things like the Janissary Corps and other parts of the Ottoman military infrastructure and military force, they are trying to overhaul the dockyards, they're trying to overhaul their ships, and they're trying to build a new fleet at the same time. You need all the experience you can get in that scenario. And the trouble is, you aren't going to get the experience you want unless you give them positions that they will be happy with. So when the British ambassador is making a point, there are lots of sources of information that are helping him make that point. One of the other interesting things is that after this battle, the reports from the ship which survive and go immediately not just to Adolf Slade here and the Sultan, but also are given to the senior Royal Navy Admiral on station. The Royal Navy are very well informed with what events are going on in this war. They have a very good appraisal of it. And they are included at almost every single level in the discussions. So, why then are there no ships of the line sent to Sinop? Why does he advise against it? Is it because, as I said earlier, and as a lot of information seems to back up, they just weren't in the state to go, or was it a conspiracy? Because this was actually thrown around time. We think the false flag conspiracies, etc., are something new. We think people sort of claiming these attacks, oh, they were lulled into doing that attack, and so that would give us an excuse to get involved. Here's the thing: you don't have to do the attack. You choose to make the attack. But in this scenario, no. If you consider it, the idea of the belief was the fort was strong enough to hold Sinop, and therefore the Russians wouldn't be able to do what they did, and therefore the ships of the line which could have been deployed there, but if they had been, would have been stuck there with no supplies and no support and no chance of getting them into a better condition because Sinop wasn't built up enough to support them. Didn't need to be deployed. They could be held back and they could be modernized and repaired. And then the crews, which are building up experience operating the frigates, when they come back, especially large frigates, will provide personnel to go in, key personnel to go into those ships' line to turn them into effective fighting units. There is a logical, thought-out plan. The Ottomans have put together. Yes, they're using British advice for it, but it's also the Ottomans. The Ottomans are leading it. And so they're basically taking a calculated risk. Unfortunately, that's not necessarily the best calculated risk to take, because we have to consider the ships the Russians come along with. Now, the first squadron which turns up, I have to admit, is made up of the second-rate ships of the line, the Imperatsa Maria, the Chesma, and the Rostov. The Imperatsa Maria is Nakimov's normal flagship. He likes her. She is a very good sailing ship, she's a very comfortable sailing ship, and she is a capable vessel. They are then reinforced by frigates, by steamers, and by 3 first-rate ships of the line, each with 120 guns. That is a lot of firepower. I've seen stats go around where people go, this means they're bringing 700 cannon to the battle. Yeah, but if they were all 4-pound cannon, it wouldn't matter if you were having 700 at the battle, would it? This is why I hate it when people do analysis based on the number of guns in a fleet or the number of missiles in a fleet. If they're all sea scepters, they're great at short to medium range air defense. But they're not really what I want for taking out major enemy ships. So not useful for that. Numbers is a quick thing you can grab hold of. And it's often good to have some statistics to compare. But turning around to this and going, well, This meant that they had over 700 guns. Really? Well, that does surprise me. If you consider every first rate and second rate there adds up to 204 guns, that takes it up to 612 in 6 ships. But, you know, 3 of those have to 50% more firepower than the other 3. And then you sort of go, well, you know, there's a 54 gun and a 44 gun. Well, that's another 98 guns. So you're at 612 plus 98, that's 710. Add in the remaining 12, and that's 722 guns. Do you really want to claim that the 4 guns aboard the Krim are going to be the same utility and same firepower as the lowest gun deck on any of those first rates? Probably not. Which one will do have the more firepower? Which one is firing the explosive shells? That's the question. They're good ships, they are good crews, and the Russians are a capable fighting force at this point. Please do not get me wrong, the Russian fleet in the Age of Sail in many ways is peaking. They have a lot of uniform ships, they have a lot of high quality ships, they have had a lot of continued investment, and it's an era where you can throw muscle at a problem and it will work. That is not, again, me being rude about Russia. That is me stating a very big problem. A big problem for Russia, an ongoing problem which they don't really get a handle of till, I would argue, post-World War II, is national education standards. Because the country as vast as Russia is, it's very difficult to get a uniform education standards going across that many time zones with the level of technology you have at the time. People can travel for weeks and never step out of their corner of Russia. It's often disturbing to some people to try and explain just how vast it is. So yeah, they have problems. Most big countries do. It's the advantage of smaller countries. And we have the Ottomans. The Ottomans have their own problems. Especially once we start looking at this fleet list and go through exactly what happened to these ships. Because you've got the frigate, that 44 guns, grounded. The Fazilla, originally the Russian Naval, burned and grounded. The Nizma frigate, 62 guns, grounded after losing 2 masts. The Nessun Zephyr frigate, 60 guns, grounded after the anchor chain broke. The Navek Bari frigate, 58 guns, exploded. The Damat frigate, 56 guns, Egyptian, grounded. The Kaid Zephyr frigate, 54 guns, grounded. The Knell Fission corvette, 24 guns. We'll have a look at what ours. The Fazil Mahmoud corvette, 24 guns, grounded. The Kel Safid corvette, 22 guns, exploded. The Taif paddle frigate, a paddle frigate, 24 guns. Retreat to Innsmouth, sister ship Faiza Abari is shown, and Ekel steamer 10 guns. Now, please note there is a small problem in all these gun numbers and all these ship numbers and their legacy. Because you will find for Taif many different stats for it. Many different stats for it. And why do you find those many different stats? Well, I can tell you. Because she's a fun little ship. She really is. But she is a Mercedes class frigate. A Mercedes class frigate. There are 4 of those. There is Mercedes, Taif, Sheikh Hassadi, and Feza Bari. Feza Bari is what's pictured. They have 24 32-pounder guns in their main deck, which is their pierced for. They have 4 32-pounder guns on their upper deck, which they're not pierced for, but they carry. And they have some 10-inch shell guns on the upper deck. 2 10-inch ones. Again, not pierced for, but they carry. And again, the Ottomans are carrying the shell guns. So this is one of the points I make about this battle. When we look at this list, going through, all these ships have exploded. We go to this group, which are also getting shells fired at them, and they've not exploded. If we go to the battle stats and we consider the battle stats, so let's consider the battle stats. Let's consider those. 6 ships of the line, 2 frigates and 3 steamers. That's the Russian force. They lose 37 killed and 229 wounded. Believe it or not, those ships are all wooden as well. The Ottomans, well, they have 7 frigates, 3 corvettes and 2 steamers there. They have 3,000 killed. They have a frigate sunk, a steamer sunk. They have 6 frigates grounded in various levels of damage. They have all 3 corvettes ground themselves, but one of them later explodes, or explodes quite soon. There's a whole debate as to when the Kel Sofid explodes in the sources I've read, and that worries me. When there's a debate over when something explodes, ships exploding are quite a big thing. It's usually quite a big explosion, so it should be kind of obvious. And 2 shore batteries were destroyed. The paddle frigate, the Teuf, escapes. The Kiel steamer, well, she's sunk. She is sunk. That's the easy way to put it. And the honest way to put it. She might well ground as well before she sinks, but she sinks. It's not good for them. Now, prior to the battle, there hadn't been much going on. As I've said, there has not been much going on. The Russian forces have occupied Ottoman principalities along the Danube and some key forts. Mediation had broken down. Abdulmajid I had responded with a declaration of war. This is after the Russians already invaded his territories. And the UK and France issued a concurrent ultimatum. As long as Russia stayed on the defensive and did not try and take any more Ottoman territory, Britain and France would remain neutral. If Russia acted aggressively, the Western powers reserved the right to get involved. That's a very clever wording, because what does aggressive define? And that's where this battle comes in. This is why hostilities begin, technically, on the 4th of October, because that's when things are supposed to happen, and that's when Sultan Abdulmajid orders an offensive to... Basically, his plan is he goes on the offensive to show Ottoman strength before negotiations and before the Ottoman Empire collapses due to financial issues. Which is why the fleet is doing what it's doing, of course. It's reinforcing. Now, I've said all this. But in terms of the battle itself, and in terms of where they've got to, well, this convoy, led by Osman Pasha, had needed to find somewhere to seek winter quarters, because the Black Sea, it's not that great a place to be wandering around in winter when you've got heavily laden ships. You want to go somewhere secure, so Sinop is where he finds. And when he gets there, he finds a frigate from another earlier patrol, and they find a steamed frigate. The Teuf joins them, so he goes from the force he did have, which was about 5 frigates, to 7 frigates. But of course, no ships of the line. No ships of the line. When St. Petersburg learnt that there was a Ottoman squadron staying in Sinop, they sent orders to Nakhimov to muster his fleet and interdict them. Russian ships go all over the Black Sea at this point. They managed to capture 2 Ottoman steamers, the Mezer Tajit and the Pervaz Bari, in relatively short engagements. Relatively, I say. Honestly, those battles were more about older Ottoman vessels being pounced upon. And this is mostly because the Ottomans are starting to run out of supplies, so they're starting to run out of the funds to keep their fleet going. So this is another reason they're seeking winter quarters, to save money, so that they can, rebuild their supplies. And, well, with all these ships out wandering around and storms forcing Nakhimov to send his forces back for repair, he continues to search. He's searching for Osman. He starts searching for that convoy, and he finds him on the 23rd of November. In fact, he sighted Osman's flagship entering the harbour at Sinop. And so Nakhimov starts a blockade. This is a very light blockade, and he has to send off his only frigate, which was with his group, to retrieve reinforcements, because he's only got 3 ships, the 3 84 gun vessels, with him. On the 30th of November, after hearing this, Novosibirsk brings 6 more ships to join Nakhimov. They are expecting additional steamers, but frankly, Nakhimov feels he has to act before the Ottomans can be reinforced, because he presumes ships to line are coming to support them. In contrast, Osman had been aware of Russian presence since the 23rd, felt his ships were in safe harbour, so safe that he allowed his crews to disembark, feeling that their harbour defences and forts, which had interlocking fields of fire and ample cannon, were secure. But the trouble is, they were old cannon. They hadn't been maintained. There's all sorts of issues going on with those cannon. It looks really impressive. It looks good. It's not good. It's just not good. And when Nakhimov and Novolisky decide to go in, well, they're deciding to go in the face of all that firepower. Their plan was to deploy their fleet into 2 columns, to get as close to the enemy force as they could, and then swivel round and open fire. At this point, he had very specific instructions, did Nakhimov. The Imprezia Maria, his flagship, was to fire upon the Anu Allah, which was the flagship, the 44-gun frigate flagship of the Ottoman force. He wanted to take that out quickly, and his own ship was going to be the methodology of doing that. And this they did. On the 30th of November, the Russian vessels enter the harbour. They come from northwest in a, broadly speaking, triangular formation. And when I say broadly speaking triangular formation, it looks more like you've got a sort of... I'm trying to remember the name for a rhombus, which has been sort of squashed and partially cut off at one end. That's more of a case of what it looks like. But what they did manage to do by manoeuvring so quickly, so closely, was to keep the Ottoman vessels between the Russian ships and Sinop's harbour's defences, which exposed, of course, the Ottomans to their friendly fire, because whilst they did have interlocking fire, they didn't have the ability to fire over their own ships. That's a problem for them. Now, the Russians managed to get off their shells first. This enabled the Russians to score early victories, and also to induce panic. The Ottoman ships were at low crew, because a lot of crew have been allowed to go ashore, because they want to give them time off so they don't have to pay them. And these are frigates, again. These are lighter walled than the ship's line. They're lighter hulled. They're designed for a maneuver battle, not a pitch battle, and this was the very definition of a pitch battle, considering both sides are anchor. Now, the sailors tried to do that were aboard tried to do firefighting, but with fire and shrapnel continuing to rain down on them, that kind of makes it a bit of a problem. After about 30 minutes, the Annie Allah, it was shot so full of holes, well, she had to be run aground when her anchor cable was cut. No one was quite sure who cut it. The Impreza Maria then focused her fire on the Fazli Allah, which caught fire, and the other vessels were focusing in on the Nizami and the Namid. The Guli Sefid and the Nevek Bakri both explode under the fire at certain points, as mentioned earlier. There is an interesting debate over translation of some of the names from Arabic to English spellings. I think Kel Safid is Guli Safid. I think, because different accounts have it differently, and I have both spellings. Helpfully, I've used one spelling in my Ottoman fleet list, and the other one I've used in my notes for which the ship blew up. Oh, I love to give myself challenges. I do. Now, interesting enough to TAFE, well, certain people try and claim she's a 12-gun ship. She's not. She's got 12 guns on her deck. Potentially. I was doing the maths earlier on the Mesody class, trying to figure out where some people's description of her as being a 12-gun ship. Well, she has two 10-inch and she has four 32-pounders on her deck, so that's 6. So I'm presuming that the people are thinking that she has 6 either side. Or alternatively, they're counting the 24 30-pounder guns and only counting the fact that one side she's pierced for 12. I'm not sure what they're doing. But that's often the case in life. If I understand what people are doing, then it'll be boring. She runs straight, as mentioned earlier, to the Ottoman government, and reports it on the 2nd of December to the Imperial Palace, to the Commander of the Navy, and to Admiral Stratford, who is the senior Royal Navy Admiral in the not in the Crimea, in Turkey at this time. Once the fleet's gone, well, the Russians turn their attention to the Ottoman shore batteries and destroy them. And this really pushes things, because it means they've now busted up a harbour enough that they could launch naval invasion for it. I think if they had just blown up the fleet, they might have got away with it. But they blew up the fleet and the harbour defences, which meant they were opening it up for invasion. And that is the British can claim it's a casus belli, because if you just destroy the fleet, you can say that's defensive. You're destroying the fleet so they can't supply the attacking forces. Yes, you're attacking someone in an Ottoman harbour, but you can make a case for it. The moment you start attacking and pummeling the Ottoman defences of that harbour, you are doing an offensive action, by the very definition. And that's where their problems begin. So, the battle. Unfortunately, more expensive than it probably should have been. And this is what leads to the aftermath, because St. Petersburg is jubilant. You know, the Russian government is exalted by this. The Russian Navy, which domestically was considered untested and hated, despite despite the Battle of Navarino and various other things, because the trouble is the Russian Navy never seems to manage to build a popular consensus behind it. The army is very much able to do this, but the Russian Navy never seems to be able to get to the level of we are a core force, we are part of you sort of thing going. Even when it wins, and it does win, individuals become heroes, the Navy doesn't. It's kind of strange. They have a big parade, they're very excited, and as said, many military advisors point to this and go, this is the advantage of shells, despite the fact both sides had shells. This is the disadvantage of wooden ships, despite the fact both sides have wooden ships. Very few people point out, this is the disadvantage of ships which were tied up, had reduced crews aboard because many of them were ashore and were built of more lightly framed than their counterparts. Nobody really want to get into that level of context and nuance for some reason. I can't think why. It's just terrible, really. I thought context and nuance is the exciting stuff of history. Seriously, I don't know why people don't get into it more. In Constantinople, well, that was more of a panic. Vital convoy annihilated. Yes, they managed to get through multiple the previous year, but who knows if they're going to get any through next year now with this lost. And they've lost they lost the level of control they had of the Black Sea. They never had control of the Black Sea. That's one of the things that often sort of people start going on about. They've lost control of the Black Sea. At what point did a fleet of frigates have control of the Black Sea? What you had disputed control of the Black Sea, where both sides were able to use it, as long as they didn't bump into each other. When they bumped into each other, there was going to be a problem, and that's one of the issues when you choose to winter your fleet. Wherever you park up is going to be a place where you can get bumped into. The real fear was the destruction of harbour defences, as that suddenly made Russian invasion through Sinop very, very possible. And it is that which is felt to violate the Anglo-French mandate. The port, therefore, the port as in Porte, of Constantinople, the government, therefore goes to the British and the French and goes, we need you. Having, to an extent, to buy time for their own repairs to their forces and fix their own tax base and fix their own country, having tried to deter conflict, they now have to bring everyone they can into conflict, including their allies who they owe money to, with the inevitable line of, well, if you don't, we might lose, and then who's going to pay you back? And, well, with allies on the side, war would work. It led to a massive wave of anti-Russian sentiment across Europe. And again, this is a problem for the Russians because we like to think of courting public opinion as something new. It isn't. As long as politicians have needed people to deliver for them, as long as politicians have needed people to stand up and listen to their speeches, as long as politicians have needed people to be able to grab attention headlines, you've had a problem in that the public opinion of what's popular in public will guide a lot of politicians. A lot of politicians will be led by what's popular, not necessarily what they think is right, but what's popular to get their name in paper. And this is what happens. Turkey must be defended from aggression. May regard as an international insult to maritime powers. These ships are charged with provisions for Batum, and they have been destroyed in a Turkish harbour, which is Turkish territory, which England is bound to protect. That comes from, well, some of the more hawkish personalities, including, of course, Ambassador Seymour. Ambassador Seymour was ambassador to the court of St. Petersburg. Pretty much, immediate term is the Anglo-French forces join the Crimean War, and we have all that. And that becomes a major part of the consequences, but Russia has managed to shoot itself in the foot really in multiple ways, because they have now widened the war. They've now given the British and the French the impetus and justification they needed for joining the war. And Russia versus both of those is a problem for them, because Russia still needs to import a lot of goods, and they need to get them in by sea because they don't have the infrastructure going around their country by land to get them in. Which means allowing the British and French into the war just means that you're going to lose. It might be soon and kept relatively short and sharp and sweet and in a certain place, or it might be a long time, in which case you'll probably have British ships dancing all around your country, dropping off people to go, hello, can we burn this down? After all, why mess with a winning formula? But saying that, it's still celebrated this day. It's one of the great victories of the Russian Navy, and it's still talked about. Admittedly, I wouldn't necessarily consider it as great a victory as they tend to mark it out as, but, you know, it's a good victory. It's a solid victory. It's a win. Even if it does bring absolutely tragic consequences for the rest of the war effort, it is a win. You cannot deny that particular one. What's this other bit of legacy? Well, it's got quite a bit of legacy, really, in this terms of this conflict. You've got the current Admiral Nakhimov is, of course, the Kirov, which is in massive maintenance, slated to take over from Peter Velicki, and we're not quite sure whether Peter Velicki will be sent into refit herself for a very long time, or whether she'll be scrapped. But Nakhimov has been in refit since 2006, and well, they've been reporting this year she'll be out by 2024. We'll see if that happens. But she has now been in refit for 18 of her 37 years on this earth. So I'm fairly sure that's a pretty much new build ship at this point. It might not be. There's always a possibility it isn't. But at a certain point, surely it's a new build. Now, I don't want to jump off too far, though, before I get into Adolphus Slade. He is a very easy person to slate, as he's in charge, and he's the one who's been brought in to be in charge, and he's been in charge since 1844, but he actually does try. And I think he's facing insurmountable odds in some regards to try and get the Ottoman fleet up to the standard it once was at this point. Instead of equivalent standard to what it once was. But saying that, he has written some interesting works, which are still able to be got today. I own some of them. The one I specifically know I own, but I'm sure I own a couple of others of this, is of Maritime States and Military Navies, which was published in 1859. You can buy copies of books, you can look up and find copies of books on Google online, and they are still core text to read. Because whilst he certainly has a flair for narrative and a flair for writing pictures, he also has this obsession with accuracy. And you see that in what he's producing. He gives you a lot of very, very accurate, very useful information. So if you're interested in this at the period, please go look up his books. Turkey and the Crimean War, a narrative of historical events, published in 1867. Well, seeing as he was out there, he will know. What else have we got coming up? Well, the year of technology is over, so there's something else going to be out on Tuesday. And, well, I think this video is going to probably go live on the 30th of November, so I wouldn't be surprised if it's the 4th of December that the live is for this. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed. I hope you found it interesting. And, well, yes. Take care. I bet you thought I'd forgotten the question. I haven't. I just decided to did it as a different video earlier and then didn't like that video recording, so I'm now adding it in again. So, today's question is this. My view and I would like to ask your opinions on this, is that no matter what happens, the use of shells is going to have an impact, whether the Ottomans win or the Russians win. But I think if the Ottomans win, it's going to be pushing more the idea of light, fast ships armed with shells are going to wreck the enemy, i.e. a Juno-Cole style. Whereas the Ottomans win kind of lead to the ironclad frigates, as they are big, large ships which have a lot of heavy shell guns. I'd like to know if you agree with that, or if you don't. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Why did I have peas at lunch? I've been having hiccups ever since. It's been terrible. It was finishing off what was in the freezer. Peas for lunch, though. Ay, caramba.